Speaking of giants, I have the honor tonight to welcome and introduce our Pride speaker, Idit Klein. For over 30 years, Idit has supported and led national movements for justice and change. Since 2001, Idit has served as the president and CEO of Keshet, an organization leading the charge for LGBTQ equality in Jewish life. Under Idit's leadership, Keshet has grown into a nationally renowned hub for Jewish organizing, mobilizing and connecting thousands of Jewish leaders across the country in support of queer Jewish life and LGBTQ inclusion. Hundreds of young people, including teens right here at Central, have found their queer communities and their Jewish identity through Keshet. Idit, thank you for building and sustaining Jewish spaces of acceptance and love in which generations of young people have been nurtured and embraced. You have enriched the promise of our people and pointed the way to a more loving and proud Jewish future.
Thank you so much, Hilly. Shabbat Shalom. Pride Sameach. I only get to say that once a year together. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you tonight. And Mazal Tov to the B'nai Mitzvah. When I came out in college, I wanted to call my third grade Orthodox rabbi to say thank you. Let me tell you why. I had transferred from a public school to an Orthodox day school at the start of third grade. I had never seen a Chumash, a book of Torah, before, so my teacher took me aside on the first day of school. He put a Chumash in front of me and he flipped it open. And he pointed at the center of the page and he said, "Here is the main story." And then he pointed to the left-hand column and he said, "And here," and he pointed to the bottom of the page and he said, "And here. Here are what two different people have to say about that story." Sometimes they disagree with one another. Sometimes I disagree with them. And you know what? Sometimes you may disagree with them, or you may disagree with me. But I want you to remember. And then he bent down so he could look me right in the eye. And he said, "I want you to remember, I always want to know what you think." So there I was, an 8-year-old girl growing up in a secular Israeli family. And I was handed the keys to Jewish tradition. I had a place in our collective Jewish story, no question. Now, I'm not going to say that my Orthodox Jewish day school education led me directly to become a professional queer Jew, but it for sure played a role years later when I came out. Because when I came out in college in 1993, I never for a millisecond doubted my place in the Jewish world. I soon learned, though, that there were some others who saw it quite differently. A small but vocal group of student leaders called for my resignation from our Hillel board. I also started hearing from other LGBTQ Jews on campus, both those who would never think of setting foot in Hillel, and those who were involved in Hillel but closeted. All shared stories of rejection by childhood rabbis, bullying in youth group and camp, an overwhelming sense of alienation in the Jewish community. For them, the messages were clear. You are not part of the collective Jewish story. You don't belong here. You do not have a place. It's 30 years later, and so much has changed. So tonight, I want to share some stories with you about what the arc of that change has looked like. When I first started building Keshet in the early 2000s, people generally looked bewildered when I told them what I did for work. They would say things like, "Now, is that a Jewish issue? Really, is it?" Or, "Gay and lesbian Jews, are there really many of you?" These days, the most common response I get is, "Can you please come work with my synagogue? We'd love your support." Or, "I have a gay son," or "I have a trans granddaughter. How can we connect them with Keshet?" And yet, of course, challenges persist. Now, a year ago, I would have focused my remarks only on the hundreds of anti-LGBTQ bills filed in state legislatures around the country, and I will say more about that in a bit. But this year, in addition to the continued assault on LGBTQ rights, I must name the dramatic rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th and its impact on those of us in the queer Jewish community. We hear directly from young people that they are feeling it. At Keshet Youth Shabbatonim, or Shabbat retreats, queer Jewish teens and young adults are able to exhale, to find their place and their voice as Jewish leaders. Many of these young people tell us that the Keshet Shabbaton is the only place, still in 2024, the only place where they can be fully themselves as LGBTQ Jews. Over and over, we hear from kids who are secular, who are Orthodox, and everything in between. We hear from them, it just feels amazing to be in a place where I can be fully myself as a queer Jew. A gay teen from New Jersey told us, "This Shabbaton helped me realize that I can be who I am and there is nothing wrong with that. I can be gay and Jewish and my own awkward self," I love that line, "and still be able to make an impact on the world." A queer teen from Iowa told us, "I really enjoyed being able to exist as both Jewish and queer in peace." I feel like Jewish spaces are often still unaccepting of queerness, and nowadays queer spaces can be unaccepting of Jewishness, so you never get a rest. You're always on the lookout for homophobia and anti-Semitism. But at the Keshet Shabbaton, I could finally rest. It's meaningful to me to know that Keshet is providing safe, supportive spaces for youth who are having trouble finding them. But it's also profoundly sad that in 2024, some queer Jewish kids feel so alone in both their Jewish and queer communities. So how can we change that? And how do we respond to anti-Semitism in the queer community today? At Keshet, we respond generally by leaning into relationships and trusting that brave conversations, more often than not, make a difference. A few months ago, I had one of those brave conversations. One of our partners, a major national LGBTQ rights organization, had put out a statement about Israel and Gaza that we found troubling. So I took a deep breath and I reached out to the CEO for a conversation. We met for 2.5 hours, and I shared with her what I and many Jews found troubling about the statement. I also talked about what was painful for me personally as an Israeli American who has long worked for Israeli-Palestinian peace. I'm not going to pretend that we emerged from the conversation magically seeing everything in the same way, but I can tell you that my words had an impact. She assured me that the most problematic aspects of the statement would not be shared again by her organization, and they haven't been. Now, had we publicly condemned her organization's statement with our own organization's statement, which you may have noticed is a pattern in our world, if we had done that, we wouldn't have achieved a thing except forever damage our relationship. In my heart, part of me wanted to just distance myself and not engage at all, but I pushed myself to lean into the relationship and enter into a vulnerable conversation. That made all the difference. Another story for you. Every year, Keshet organizes contingents to march in Pride in the 6 regions of the country where we have staff on the ground, including this city. This year, for the first time ever, we worried about Jewish safety not only from right-wing protesters. We also worried that LGBTQ people might target us with anti-Semitic speech or worse. A longtime Keshet member in his late 50s came to talk with me, and he told me about joyously marching in Pride every year since the early 80s. And then he cried. He cried, telling me that for the first time, he felt afraid of his own queer community. At Keshet, we considered whether we should skip Pride this year. We asked ourselves, is it just too dangerous? Is it not responsible? Ultimately, we decided that we had to show up for every queer Jew who fears they don't have a place in the Jewish community or in the LGBTQ community, or both. We needed to show up for every queer Jew who wants their Jewishness to be honored and celebrated, who wants to exult in pride. And so, in partnership with a wider bridge, we developed guidelines for Pride organizers to make Pride as safe and inclusive as possible for Jews. And in every single case, from Boston to San Francisco, from New York to Chicago, Pride organizers were receptive and grateful to us for these recommendations. Without exception, they pledged to implement them, and they did. So where do we go from here? How can we bring out the best in ourselves and in each other at a time when fear, loneliness, and discord are swirling all around us? One thing it will take is for us to be clear that simply being tolerated in our own Jewish communities cannot be the goal. No one wants to be tolerated in the community that is their home. Yet too many Jewish community leaders still tell us at Keshet that they're tolerant of LGBTQ people. And do we really need to do more? The answer is yes. We must do more to embrace LGBTQ people. And all of us, LGBTQ Jews of color, LGBTQ Jews of all ages, LGBTQ Jews of varying political perspectives, all of us. So how do we cultivate these communities where LGBTQ Jews feel cherished and embraced? Within the actual and virtual walls of our institutions, we must notice the visual signs that express who belongs. We must look at the posters in our classrooms, the images on our websites, the photos in our hallways, and ask ourselves, who is represented here and who is left out? Because I can promise you that queer Jews enter Jewish institutions and ask themselves, am I seen here? Is my life reflected here? 10 years ago, Harvey Milk joined the 30 or so other Jews who have been honored by the US Postal Service with stamps in their image. How many Jewish kids are taught in day school or Hebrew school about Harvey Milk as an American Jewish hero? Consider the message it would send if teaching about Harvey Milk were a standard part of American Jewish education. If there were posters of Harvey Milk on the walls. Keshet produces them. And then there is the world beyond the walls of our institutions. In a time of unprecedented legal assaults on LGBTQ people, over 500 bills filed in state legislatures this year, in a time in which trans kids are the primary target of these attacks, what is our responsibility as a Jewish community? We know that when we speak out as Jews, we can and do make a difference. History demonstrates that clearly. Last month marked the 20th anniversary of marriage equality in the state of Massachusetts, where I live. 20 years of being able to marry the person you love, no matter their gender. Now, when marriage equality became the law in Massachusetts in 2004, our opponent struck back immediately and tried to rescind this newly won right. Keshet led the Jewish community's effort to preserve marriage equality for good. Initially, I could count on one hand the number of rabbis who were willing to publicly stand with us. Many said that they just weren't ready, or they were ready, but their congregants weren't ready. Remember, this was 2004. I'll never forget standing in front of the Massachusetts State House holding a huge banner, not by myself, and the banner said, "The Massachusetts Jewish community supports equal marriage." And at least a couple times an hour, someone would come rushing up to us and shout. They would shout, "How dare you stand here with this sign? This isn't what Jews believe." And they were right. Support for marriage equality was not the norm in Jewish life in 2004, just as it wasn't in Massachusetts as a whole, and certainly not nationally. But over the course of the 3-year fight to save equal marriage, we touched hearts and changed minds, and slowly, support for same-sex marriage did become the norm in the Massachusetts Jewish community and in Massachusetts as a whole. At the 20th anniversary celebration in Boston last month, we heard from Mary Bonato, the lead attorney who won the case for marriage equality in Massachusetts. She said to us, "We took what was unimaginable and turned it into a joyous reality," which of course is beautifully true, but what I think is even more extraordinary is that we took what was unimaginable and we turned it into an ordinary reality. Consider this reality. A 7th grader at a Hebrew school in upstate New York raised his hand in class and in a slightly trembling voice came out as transgender. He asked his classmates to start addressing him as he, him. The rabbi immediately called out, "Mazal tov," and the whole class cheered. That kid will never forget that moment of coming out in his Jewish community and being celebrated. I know so many young people who are growing up never knowing a world without marriage equality, never knowing a world without openly trans people in their lives. For them, these are not only ordinary realities, it is unimaginable that life was ever any other way. Let's think together. What vision of justice today feels beyond our imagination, yet in 20 years will simply be the ordinary reality of our world? Together, we must seize what is unimaginable and transform it into a gloriously ordinary reality. I invite you to take a step forward toward this world we dream of and make it flourish. Thank you. Pride Sameach. Shabbat Shalom.